The night was cold when Marina left the clandestine hospital with a plastic bag in her hands. Inside were two newborns wrapped in dirty rags, her own children, twins she never asked to have. She walked quickly through the empty streets of the slum, her heart beating strongly, but not with maternal love. It was fear, fear that those two tiny beings would forever ruin the life she had planned. Marina was barely 23 years old. She was a dancer in a nightclub in the city and had met a married businessman who promised to lift her out of poverty. He paid for her apartment, her clothes, her outings. He told her he loved her, that he was leaving his wife, that he just needed time. Marina believed him. She believed him for months, until she got pregnant and he vanished like smoke. He never answered her calls. He never returned to the club. He blocked her number. And Marina was left alone, with a growing belly and a rage that ate away at her insides. She didn't want to be a mother. Not of twins. Not at that moment. Not like this. Not with a man who had used and abandoned her. Not without money. Not without a future. She tried everything to get rid of the pregnancy. Pills she bought on the black market, bitter herbs a neighbor recommended. She even went to a healer in the suburbs who gave her a concoction that smelled like death and left her vomiting for 3 days straight. But the babies held firm. They were born premature, small, fragile, but alive. And now they were there, in that cheap plastic bag, as Marina walked toward the old bridge that crossed the city's polluted river. No one saw her coming. It was 3 in the morning. The street lights flickered with a yellowish light. The sound of dirty water hitting the bridge's concrete columns was the only noise in that dark dawn. Marina stopped in the center of the bridge. She looked down. The river was dark, deep, filled with floating trash, plastic bottles, rotten branches, and gray foam. Perfect for forgetting, perfect for no one asking questions. She lifted the bag with both hands. The babies were quiet. They almost looked dead, but they weren't. They were breathing. She knew it. She could feel the slight movement inside the bag. And yet, she squeezed her eyes shut, gritted her teeth, and dropped the bag into the emptiness. The sound of it hitting the water was soft, almost imperceptible, as if nothing important had fallen. Marina didn't stay to watch. She didn't want to see if the bag floated or sank. She didn't want to know if the babies were crying or drowning. She turned around and walked quickly toward the other shore, her hands shaking and her heart racing. She didn't cry. She didn't feel guilt at that moment, only relief, an enormous relief, as if a giant weight had been lifted from her shoulders, as if she could finally breathe. She went back to her apartment, showered for almost an hour, put on makeup, and the next day she was back at the club, dancing as if nothing had happened. No one knew. No one asked. The other girls at the club assumed she'd miscarried or given the babies up for adoption, and she wasn't going to tell the truth, ever. But what Marina didn't know, what she never imagined, was that night, just minutes after she left the bridge, a homeless man named Ramiro was searching for plastic bottles and cardboard on the riverbank. Ramiro was a man in his 50s who had lived under the bridge for more than a decade. He had lost everything in life: job, family, dignity, hope. A series of bad decisions, an alcohol addiction he couldn't control, and an unforgiving economy had left him homeless. But he still had some humanity left, something the world hadn't managed to take away from him. She heard a faint cry. At first she thought it was a cat or a large rat, but then she heard it more clearly. It was two voices. Babies. She ran toward the sound, stumbling over rocks and trash, and saw the bag floating among the debris. She pulled it out of the water with a long stick she used for searching and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were the twins, soaked, shivering from the cold, their lips purple but alive, incredibly alive. Ramiro didn't think twice. He wrapped them in his old jacket, the only one he had, and ran barefoot to the nearest public hospital, 6 blocks away. He arrived screaming, pleading for help from anyone who would listen. The nurses on duty looked at him suspiciously. A filthy homeless man with 2 newborn babies. They thought the worst. But when they saw the children's critical condition, they acted quickly. They took them to the emergency room. They examined them. They warmed them with special lamps. They connected them to monitors. They gave them IVs. The babies were malnourished. with severe hypothermia, early pneumonia, and dehydration. But they survived. The doctors called it a miracle. They said that if Ramiro had taken 10 more minutes to find them, they would have died. Ramiro didn't call it a miracle. He called them his children, because Ramiro, without thinking much about it, without calculating the consequences, decided to stay with them. The hospital tried to find the mother. They filed police reports, published notices in local newspapers, and investigated cases of pregnant women in the area. But no one appeared. No one claimed those children. And after 3 months of endless bureaucratic procedures, social assessments, where social workers visited the place where Ramiro slept under the bridge, psychological interviews, and proving that despite living on the streets, he had a huge heart and a fierce determination, Ramiro was granted temporary custody of the twins. He called them Matthew and Luke, names he'd heard at the church he sometimes went to on Sundays for a hot meal. And he decided at that moment that those children weren't going to grow up like him. They weren't going to end up in misery. They weren't going to know the hunger, the cold, the hopelessness he had known. He was going to do everything humanly possible to give them a decent life, even if it meant sacrificing what little he had. Ramiro stopped living under the bridge. He stopped drinking alcohol completely. He cut off connections with other homeless people who just wanted to get drunk and forget. He got a job as a parking attendant in a public parking lot downtown. He was paid very little, almost nothing. But the owner of the parking lot, a kind-hearted older man named Don Ernesto, gave him a small room in the back of the building where he could sleep with the children. It was a space barely 3 meters by 3 meters, windowless, with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling and a shared bathroom in the hallway. But it was a roof, it was safe, and it was his. Ramiro saved every penny he earned. He bought powdered milk at the cheapest stores. He bought used diapers that other mothers were selling at the market. He bought secondhand clothes at Sunday markets. It wasn't much, but it was something. And every night, when he put Mateo and Lucas to bed on the thin mattress the three of them shared, he sang them songs he remembered from his childhood and promised them that everything would get better. The years passed slowly. Mateo and Lucas grew up in that tiny room that smelled of dampness and motor oil. Ramiro took them to the park on Sundays when he didn't have to work. He taught them to read with old magazines he found in the trash in the parking lot. He told them made-up bedtime stories about pirates, astronauts, and superheroes. He told them they were special, that they had survived something most people wouldn't have survived, and that meant they had an important purpose in this world. When the twins turned 7, Ramiro enrolled them in a public school 10 blocks from the parking lot. He bought them used backpacks and secondhand notebooks. The other kids made fun of them because their clothes were patched and because they smelled of motor oil, because their father was a car park attendant who barely knew how to write his name, because they lived in a back room of a parking lot. But Mateo and Lucas didn't give in to the teasing. They studied with flashlights when the power went out. They did their homework on the floor because they didn't have a table or chairs. They shared a single pencil between them, and they always got the best grades in the entire class. One day, a teacher named Julian noticed the twins' extraordinary potential. He saw them staying after school to read every book in the small school library. He saw them helping each other with complicated math problems. He saw them ask intelligent questions that children their age didn't normally ask, and he decided to do something about it. Julian spoke with Ramiro one afternoon after school. He told him those children were brilliant, that they had a special talent, that they deserved more opportunities than the public school could offer, that there were full-ride scholarship programs for low-income students at elite private schools. Ramiro couldn't read the complicated forms well, so Julian helped him fill them out one by one. They asked for letters of recommendation. They submitted transcripts. They wrote essays about the children's situation. And months later, the news arrived that would change everything. Mateo and Lucas had been accepted into one of the city's most prestigious private schools with a full scholarship that covered tuition, uniforms, books, and even lunch. It was the happiest day of Ramiro's life. He cried like he hadn't since he was a child. He hugged his children so tightly they could hardly breathe. He told them he was prouder of them than words could express, and they earnestly promised him that they would never, ever let him down, that they would study harder than anyone else, that they would make his sacrifice worthwhile. If this story touches your heart, Leave a comment telling me how you feel. And if you want to continue hearing thought-provoking stories, subscribe to the channel. At private school, the twins excelled even more than before. They were the best students in every class they were in. They won national science competitions. They participated in international math Olympiads. They learned English, French, and programming. And while the other students had millionaire parents, huge houses, trips abroad, and the latest technology, Matteo and Lucas had something no money could buy: an insatiable hunger for success, an iron determination, and a permanent memory of where they came from. They never forgot that while their classmates arrived in their year-old cars, they walked an hour to school. They never forgot that while others had personal computers, they used the ones at the public library. They never forgot that they had a father who worked 12 hours a day, watching cars under the blazing sun so they could have clean notebooks and presentable uniforms. When they turned 18, both twins won full scholarships to study engineering at the country's most prestigious university, a university where the children of presidents, businessmen, and ambassadors studied. Romero was seriously ill by then. Years of hard work under the sun, sleeping on concrete floors, eating poorly, and neglecting his health had taken a brutal toll on his body. He had serious back problems that prevented him from walking straight. His lungs were damaged from years of inhaling car exhaust fumes. He had diabetes that he didn't treat because he didn't have money for medicine. But he smiled with tears in his eyes every time he saw his children in their university uniforms, their backpacks full of expensive books, walking toward a future he never had. Matteo and Lucas studied like mad for 5 years. They worked part-time in cafes and bookstores to help Ramiro with the medical bills that mounted every month. They slept 4 hours a night. They ate cheap noodles. They turned down party invitations. They had no time for girlfriends or fun, but they didn't give up. Ever. Because they knew that everything they did, every exam they passed, every project they completed, was for the man who had saved them from the river, for the man who sacrificed everything for them, for the man who gave them a chance when the entire world had discarded them like garbage. They graduated with top honors, both of them, at the same time, with perfect GPAs, with job offers from the best companies in the country. And at the graduation ceremony, Ramiro was in the front row, sitting in a wheelchair because he could no longer walk, wearing his best shirt, which he had washed 5 times to make it spotless, weeping with pride with sobs he couldn't control. Shortly after graduating, the twins began working at a multinational technology company. They started at the bottom, as underpaid interns, but their talent was undeniable. They solved problems that senior engineers couldn't. They created innovative solutions. They worked until the wee hours without complaining. And in less than 2 years, they had already risen to management positions with salaries Ramiro couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. With their first good salaries, they did something they dreamed of since they were little children. They bought Ramiro a house. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't luxurious, but it had 3 bedrooms with large windows, a small garden with flowers, working heating, a private bathroom with hot water, and it was in a safe, the middle-class neighborhood where neighbors greeted each other and there were trees lining the streets. Ramiro cried when they gave him the keys. He told them in a broken voice that he had already received more than he deserved in this life, that he was already happy just seeing them succeed. But Matteo and Lucas firmly told him that they were just getting started, that this was only the beginning of everything they were going to do for him, because they had a plan. An ambitious plan they'd been secretly developing for years. They wanted to create their own technology company, but not just any company, a company specifically focused on solutions for low-income communities, for people like them, for people the system had forgotten. They wanted to create apps that would connect informal workers with clients who needed their services. Digital platforms where small entrepreneurs from poor neighborhoods could sell their products without intermediaries keeping most of the profits. Completely free digital education systems for children who didn't have access to good schools. Financial tools for people rejected by traditional banks. They worked on the project for 3 years while holding down their day jobs. They saved every penny they could. They lived in a small shared apartment to avoid spending on rent. They ate simple, homemade meals. They didn't buy expensive clothes or unnecessary technology. All surplus money went into the company fund. They sought investors by presenting their idea to dozens of venture capital firms who rejected them time and again, saying that a business focused on the poor wasn't profitable. They pitched their project at startup competitions where they were mocked for having accents that betrayed their humble origins. But they didn't give up. They kept trying. They kept improving their pitch. And finally, after being rejected 27 times, they secured seed funding from an investor who had grown up in poverty and understood their vision. The company was named Bridge, like the bridge where they almost lost their lives that cold night more than 20 years ago, but also as a powerful symbol of connection, of moving from one place to another, of not remaining stuck in misery, of reaching out to those in need. The first 3 years of the company were brutally hard. There were months when Matteo and Lucas went without a salary to pay their small team of 5 employees. There were weeks when they slept in the office to save time commuting. There were moments of despair where they thought they were going to go bankrupt and lose everything. But they believed deeply in what they were doing. They believed they could change lives, and their obsessive effort began to bear unexpected fruits. One of their apps, designed to help street vendors receive digital payments without a traditional bank account, went viral in working-class neighborhoods. Within 6 months, they had 100,000 users. Within a year, 1 million. The media began to talk about them as the entrepreneurs revolutionizing financial inclusion. Large investors who had previously rejected them now urgently wanted to meet with them. International awards began to pour in. And in less than 5 years, Puente became one of the most valuable technology companies in the country, with a market valuation of over $200 million. Matteo and Lucas became millionaires at 29. They appeared in business magazines. They gave lectures at elite universities. They were invited to international economic forums, but they didn't change their essence. They continued to live with relative humility. They didn't buy ostentatious mansions or luxury sports cars. They continued to visit Ramiro every Sunday without fail to eat together and tell him about their projects. And they continued to remember every day where they came from and why they did what they did. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Marina was still working at the same nightclub where she'd been for the past 20 years. But she was no longer the attractive young dancer she'd once been. She was 43 years old, deep wrinkles around her eyes and mouth, extra pounds that no diet could remove, stretch marks on her abdomen that reminded her of the pregnancy she'd tried to forget. And no wealthy businessman sought her out or even looked at her anymore. The young girls had taken her place on the main stage. She now bussed tables and served drinks in the back of the club. She lived alone in the same small one-room apartment she'd always lived in. She drank too much cheap wine every night. She smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. She took sleeping pills because insomnia constantly plagued her. And every night, when she finally closed her eyes after the pills and alcohol, she saw exactly the same recurring image: a plastic bag falling in slow motion into the dark water of the river. Sometimes in her dreams, she ran to catch it but never made it in time. Sometimes the bag would open in the air, and she'd see the faces of babies looking up at her as they fell. Sometimes she would wake up screaming. She never forgot what she did that night, even though she tried so hard. Even though she lied to herself, telling herself she had no choice. Even though she tried to convince herself she'd done the right thing. The truth was, she lived in a permanent mental hell. A hell of guilt that no amount of alcohol could drown. One day, Marina was cleaning tables at the club when she saw a special report on the bar's television about 2 successful young entrepreneurs who had created a revolutionary technology company. The journalist spoke excitedly about their inspiring story, about how they had been abandoned as newborn babies and miraculously rescued by a humble man who raised them with unconditional love despite living in extreme poverty. They showed current photos of them in elegant suits. They showed videos of their modern offices. They showed graphs of their entrepreneurial success. And Marina felt like the floor had literally opened up beneath her feet and swallowed her into an abyss. It was them, her children, the babies she'd thrown into the river that freezing night. She stood completely paralyzed in front of the television, holding a dirty rag. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She couldn't believe what her eyes were seeing. They had survived, not just survived. They had triumphed spectacularly. They were millionaires, famous, successful, admired. respected, everything she had never managed to be, everything she had destroyed in her own life with bad choices. For weeks on end, Marina couldn't sleep at all, even with the strongest pills. The guilt ate at her from the inside like an emotional cancer. She stopped going to work. She locked herself in her apartment. She began obsessively researching everything about Matteo and Lucas. She read every interview they'd ever given to newspapers and magazines. She watched every video of them online. She studied every photo, trying to find some physical trait of hers on their faces. And in every word they said in the interviews, in every genuine smile they showed, in every achievement they celebrated, she saw everything she had denied them. She saw everything they had achieved despite her attempt to kill them. Finally, after a month of unbearable mental agony, Marina made a desperate decision. She had to find them. She had to talk to them face to face. She had to apologize. She had to try to explain why she did what she did, even though she knew there was no explanation that could justify abandoning babies in a river. She found the address of Puente's main office by searching online. She put on her best clothes, which still looked old and cheap. She put on makeup, trying to hide the marks of time and suffering. And she went unannounced, without an appointment, trembling with nerves throughout the 2-hour bus ride. She arrived at a modern glass building in the city's financial center, a building she had never entered in her life, a world completely foreign to her. She told the young, elegant receptionist that she urgently needed to speak with Matteo and Lucas, that it was an extremely important personal matter. Could she please let her see them for at least 5 minutes? The receptionist told her with professional coldness that the founders only receive visitors by appointment, scheduled at least 2 weeks in advance. Marina insisted with growing desperation. She raised her voice. She began to cry right there at the reception desk. Other employees passing by stared at her uncomfortably, and finally, an executive assistant came out to see what all the fuss was about. Marina told him through sobs who she was. She told him she was the founder's biological mother. She desperately needed to talk to them, asking him to please give her just one chance. The assistant looked at her with a mixture of distrust and surprise, but something in the woman's genuine desperation made him believe she might be telling the truth. She agreed to pass the message on to Matteo and Lucas, though she warned them that it would be up to them to decide whether or not to receive it. Matteo and Lucas were in an important meeting with Japanese investors when their assistant sent them an urgent message. At first, they thought it was a bad joke, or a con artist looking for money by fabricating false relationships. But something about the woman's physical description and the details she had mentioned caught their attention and generated a strange unease. They apologized to the investors and decided to receive the message just to confirm it was a lie and be able to get rid of her quickly. When Marina entered the private meeting room, she saw them for the first time since that horrible night 23 years ago when they were defenseless babies. They stood by a huge window overlooking the city, dressed in elegant, expensive suits, with cold, unreadable gazes. They were tall, handsome, self-assured. They bore no physical resemblance to her, but something deep within her screamed that they were her children. The blood of her blood, the flesh of her flesh that she had tried to kill. Marina knelt on the cold marble floor. She wept uncontrollably, moans that came from the depths of her shattered soul. And between tears and broken words, she begged their forgiveness. She told them everything in brutally honest detail: the unwanted pregnancy, the financial despair, the panic of ruining her life, the businessman who abandoned her, the old bridge, the plastic bag, the dark river, the sound of the crash against the water that haunted her nightmares every night since then. Matteo and Lucas listened to her in absolute silence for several minutes that seemed like hours. They said nothing. They didn't move. Their faces showed no emotion. They just stared at her as she poured out her broken soul in front of them. Finally, after a terrible silence, Lucas spoke in a controlled but hard voice. "Why are you here now, after 23 years? Marina looked up at him tearfully. "Because I'm deeply sorry. Because what I did was horribly wrong. Because I've lived in hell all these years. Because I need forgiveness so I can go on living." Matteo slowly shook his head. "You didn't come because you were truly sorry. You came because you saw us on TV, because we're successful millionaires, because we're on the news. If we had died in that river as you planned, If we had grown up poor and forgotten, you would never have felt a thing. You would never have come looking for us. You would never have shed a single tear. Marina tried to weakly defend herself, stammering out some excuse, but Matteo continued speaking with a cutting coldness. You threw us into a river like garbage, as if we were waste. You left us to drown or freeze to death. And if we're still alive today, it's not thanks to you or your conscience. It's thanks exclusively to a man who had absolutely nothing material in this world, but who had a huge heart and gave us everything he had. Lucas added with a voice trembling with suppressed rage, that man is our father, the only father we have and recognize, the man who saved our lives, the man who sacrificed his health and well-being so we could study, the man who never, not for a single day, made us feel unwanted. You are not our mother. You are simply the person who abandoned us, the person who tried to kill us. We owe you nothing. We want nothing from you, and we don't need your belated and convenient repentance. Marina pleaded desperately. She said she was willing to change completely, that she wanted to be a part of their lives in some way, that they could help her become a better person, that she deserved a second chance, that we all make mistakes, that she was young and scared, that she didn't know what she was doing. But Matthew was absolutely clear and definitive. Get out of this office right now. We don't want to see you again. We don't want to hear from you. We don't need your guilty contrition, and we definitely don't owe you a second chance. You had your chance when we were born, and you chose to throw us into a river. That was your decision. Now you live with the consequences. They asked her to leave immediately. A security guard appeared at the door to escort her if necessary. And Marina left that office completely devastated, staggering, sobbing in a way that caught the attention of every employee. She left the building and walked aimlessly through the streets for hours until dark. Months passed. Marina fell into severe clinical depression. She permanently stopped working at the club. She stopped eating properly. She lost so much weight that she seemed terminally ill. She completely isolated herself from the world. She didn't answer calls. She didn't open the door when someone knocked. She lived in the darkness of her apartment with the curtains always closed. She seriously considered suicide several times. She even wrote farewell letters. But something, perhaps cowardice or perhaps a last glimmer of hope, always stopped her at the last moment. Until one day, several months after that terrible encounter, there was a persistent knock on her apartment door. Marina didn't want to open it, but the person on the other end continued knocking for 10 minutes without stopping. Finally, she resignedly opened the door, expecting to find the landlord demanding back rent. But it was Lucas. Marina couldn't believe it. She thought she was hallucinating, that she had finally lost her mind completely. She rubbed her eyes. But he was still there, standing in her dirty hallway, now dressed in casual clothes, staring at her with an expression that was no longer one of pure hatred, but something more complex that she couldn't decipher. She asked him in a hoarse voice what he was doing there. Lucas asked her permission to enter. Marina nodded, confused. He entered the dark and messy apartment, looked around without judgment, and sat down on the only armchair there. Lucas told him he had been thinking a lot these past few months, that he had spoken at length with Matteo about what had happened, that they had also spoken with Ramiro, who was now very ill and possibly had only a few months to live, and that Ramiro had told them something profound that had made them completely reconsider their position. Ramiro had told them in a weak voice from his hospital bed, "Forgiveness isn't something you do for the person who hurt you. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself. To free yourself from the hatred that poisons you inside. To be able to move forward without carrying that terrible weight in your heart. I raised you to be better than the circumstances that surrounded you. To be better than the people who hurt you. Forgiveness is the final proof that you've made it." Lucas told Marina in a softer voice that they weren't going to have a mother-son relationship, that they were never going to call her mom, that they probably could never love her, but that they had decided, after much painful reflection, that they were willing to help her, not because she deserved it, because she clearly didn't, but because they had consciously decided to be better people than she was, because they had decided to break the cycle of abandonment and pain, because they had decided to show that despite how their lives began, they chose compassion over revenge. They offered to pay for comprehensive psychological treatment with top professionals, a rehabilitation program for his addictions to alcohol and pills, an intensive vocational training course so he could find a decent, well-paying job, and a modest but sufficient monthly financial support until he was completely stable on his own. Marina couldn't speak. Tears streamed uncontrollably down her cheeks. Finally, she managed to utter between sobs, "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve any of this. I don't deserve your kindness." Lucas responded, looking her straight in the eyes. "You're right. You don't deserve it. But we are not you. We choose to be different." Marina accepted the help with profound humility. She wept with genuine gratitude for the first time in decades. And for the first time since that horrible night on the bridge, she felt something resembling inner peace. It wasn't happiness, it wasn't joy, but it was a small light in the absolute darkness that had been her life. With time and a lot of intense therapeutic work, Marina slowly began to rebuild her shattered life. She completed psychological treatment, which lasted almost 2 years. She overcame her addictions, with many relapses along the way, but with ultimate determination. She completed the training course and landed a simple but honest job at a soup kitchen that served free meals to low-income children in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. He didn't earn much money. He lived modestly, but he felt like he was finally doing something good with his life, something that gave him real purpose. Something that, in some way, even if it could never make up for what he did, at least allowed him to help other vulnerable children. Marina never became an active part of Matteo and Lucas's lives. They maintained the emotional distance they needed for their own mental health. They communicated occasionally through brief messages. She sent them photos of the cafeteria where she worked. They politely asked how her health was, but there were never hugs. There were never family dinners. There was never the mother-son relationship that might have existed under other circumstances. And Marina accepted it. She understood that was the most she could hope for, and she was deeply grateful for even that. Ramiro died at 73 in the house his children had bought for him, surrounded by Matteo and Lucas, who held his hands during his final hours. With his last breath, he told them that he was proud of them, that they had been the best decision of his life, that they had filled his final years with meaning, that he loved them more than words could express. Matteo and Lucas gave him a beautiful and dignified funeral. They invited Don Ernesto from the parking lot, Julian, the teacher who had helped them get the scholarships, and everyone who had in some way been a part of their story. And on the black marble tombstone they wrote, "Ramiro Sanchez, the man who saved us from the river and taught us that true love has nothing to do with blood, the father we chose and who chose us, the hero who never gave up on us." Marina went to the funeral. She stayed in the back, not approaching, crying silently. She knew she had no right to be in the front row. She knew that place belonged to others, but she needed to be there. She needed to honor the man who had been the father she never became a mother to. Today, 10 years after all this, Matteo and Lucas are 39 years old. They continue to run Puente, which now operates in 12 Latin American countries and has helped more than 50 million people escape extreme poverty or significantly improve their living conditions. They have created jobs for hundreds of thousands. They have provided educational scholarships to tens of thousands of talented, low-income young people. They have built schools in forgotten rural communities. They have funded free health clinics in slums. And every year, on the exact date they were rescued from the river, they donate a full 10% of their annual earnings to institutions that specifically help abandoned children. Children no one wants. Children the system forgets. Children just like they once were. In their main offices, there's a giant black and white photo of a smiling Ramiro. Below it, it says, "Everything we are, we owe to a man who had nothing but gave us everything. This company exists to honor his memory by helping others as he helped us." Marina continues to work at the soup kitchen. Now she coordinates a foster care program for teenage mothers in crisis who are considering abandoning their babies. She tells them her story without holding anything back. She shows them the consequences of abandonment. She offers them alternatives. She gives them support, and she has helped dozens of desperate young mothers make different decisions than the one she made that cold night so many years ago. It's not complete redemption, It never can be. But it's something. It's an attempt. It's a life dedicated to preventing others from making the unforgivable mistake she made. Mateo and Lucas know it, and although they never tell her directly, they're secretly proud that at least she's trying to be better, that at least she's using her terrible mistake to help others, that at least the suffering she caused wasn't completely in vain. The story of the twins who were thrown into a river and became successful millionaires has been told in books, documentaries, and conferences around the world. But what most of these versions fail to mention is the most important part, that their success is not measured in money, but in the fact that they chose forgiveness over hatred, compassion over revenge, and generosity over selfishness. They chose to be better than their circumstances, better than their abandonment, better than their pain. And in that daily choice, in that constant decision to help others instead of being bitter, they found something far more valuable than any fortune. They found peace. If you've made it this far and want to continue hearing real stories that make you reflect on life, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.